Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Alright, today I would like to explain or tell you about translation theory before the 20th century. As I've read before in the book, and as I know, the aim of this chapter is not to attempt a comprehensive history of translation or translator through the ages. This would be beyond the scope of any book. Instead, the main focus is the central recurring theme of word for word and sense for sense translation, a debate that dominates much of translation theory in that new mark. Called the pre-linguistic period of translation in this chapter, we focus on a select few of the readily available writing based on the criterion of the influence they have exerted on the history of translation theory and research. Word for word or sense for sense, the interpreter of the first line is often read by translation studies as as being the literal word-for-word translator, while the orator tried to produce a speech that moved the listeners. However, M.C.L. Duff, 2009, 136, point out that in ancient Rome, it was the low social status of the interpreter, a mediator of various kind, that was disparaged because of a lack of education. This then led to limited and pedantic understanding and to an inelegant, word-for-word Latin style. These points were to influence the work of the great Cochin translator and commentator. To summarize, this change involved, for number one, copying with the flexibility of Sanskrit syntax by reversing to a standard Chinese order, the enchantment of the literalness of the ST to adapt to an elegant Chinese style, and number three, the omission of repetitive exclamation, and number four, the reduction in the paratextual commentaries that accompany the TTS, and the last, number 5, reduction or restructuring to ensure more logical and linear discourse. And there is again humanism and the Protestant Reformation. Language and translation become the site of a huge power struggle. Latin, controlled by the court in Rome, had a strong hold over knowledge and religion until challenged by the European humanist movement of the 14th and 15th centuries. The revolution in Bible translation practice in Europe was galvanized by humanists and French in the study and knowledge of Greek and Hebrew and of classical scholarship. Its culmination was Erasmus' edition of a parallel Greek-Latin New Testament in 1516 that was used by both Tyndale and Luther. The general climate of the Reformation and the new technology of the printing press meant that Bible translation dominated book production. Fidelity spirit entered the concept of fidelity, or at least the translator who was first interpreter, the faithful interpreter, had initially been dismissed as literal. Word for word translation by Horace describes spirit as similarly having two meanings. The first, the Latin word spiritus denotes creative energy or inspiration, proper to literature, but St. Augustine used it to mean the Holy Spirit of God, and his contemporary Jerome employed in the both sense. For St. Augustine, spirit and truth, Latin veritas, were intertwined, with truth having the sense of contents. For St. Jerome, truth meant the authentic Hebrew biblical text to which he returned in his Latin Vulgate translation. In the preface to his translation of Ovid epistles in 1680, Durden reduced all translation to three categories. The first, metaphrase, word by word and line by line translation, which corresponds to literal translation. And number two, paraphrase, translation with latitude, where the author is kept in view by the translator, so as never to be lost. But his words are not so strictly followed as his sense. This involves changing whole phrase and more or less correspondence to faithful or sense for sense translation. And number three, imitation, forsaking both words and sense. This corresponds to Cowley's very free translation and is more or less what today might be understood as adaptation. 5 principles in order of importance as follows. There are around 5. Number 1 is the translator. The translator must perfectly understand the sense and material of original author, although he seeks so should feel free to clarify obscurities. And number 2, the translator should have a perfect knowledge of both SL and TL, so as not to lessen the majesty of the language. And number 3, the translator should avoid word-for-word renderings. Number 4, the translator should avoid Latin and unusual forms. And number 5, the translator should assemble and liaise words eloquently to avoid clumsiness. And where Dolt has 5 principles, titles, it has 3 general laws or rules. Number 1, the translation should give a complete transcript of the ideas of the original works. Number 2, the style and manner of writing should be of the same character with that of the original. And number 3, the translation should have all the ease of the original composition. I think like that. Also, there are several consequences of this approach, including if the translator is to seek to communicate the same impression which he or she received from the EST. This impression will also depend on the level of education and understanding among TT readership, and this is likely to differ from the translator's own understanding. And number 2, a special language of translation may be necessary. For example, compensating in one place with an imaginative word, where elsewhere the translator has to make do with a hackneyed expression that cannot convey the impression of the foreign. I think that's all that I know from that book in chapter 2. Thank you very much, and Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.